So, hello, back to our opening session of this European PVSEC 2020. I hope you could grab some coffee and are again in front of the computer screen as we are going into our opening addresses. And it will be my pleasure to introduce you Nicola Pearsall. Okay, here she is. So, Nicola Pearsall, I hope many of you know her. She was and is in principal lecturer and researcher at the Northumbria University. She's now Professor Emeritus. And in her career, she was creating the Northumbria Photovoltaics Application Center as well. A little bit less known is that she was and contributor to the 2015 World Economic Forum on solar thermal electricity, I found out. So Nicola Pearsall is our chairwoman of this conference, and it's my pleasure to ask her to give the opening address to this first online European Photovoltaic Conference. Nicola, it's your floor.
Thank you, Heinz. Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to the opening session. It's my pleasure to be acting as the general chair in this edition. Throughout the research year in photovoltaics, the European Photovoltaic Conference is extremely valuable. Allow us to the latest research advances, the different research methods results with my colleagues to renew open impact. And I'm looking forward to doing this again throughout the conference week. Of course, this edition of the conference is unlike any of the previous, I think, 36 conferences. I think this is the 37th. Unfortunately, our PV community is unable to gather together in person due to the ongoing pandemic. And so the conference is being held entirely online this year, as you already know. The organizers have worked very hard to create a bespoke platform for the conference and to retain as much of a flavor of the European PVSEC as possible. Since this is the first morning, I'm assuming that not that many of you have had a chance to really explore the platform fully. So what I'd like to do is just take a few moments to point out some of the features that I think are particularly useful for the conference before going on to consider some wider issues. The scope and format of the conference is the same as in previous years. It offers state-of-the-art presentations over a range of topics in both oral and visual sessions. And those of you who are regular delegates to the conference will actually find the format quite familiar, I think. Almost all the presentations will be live, which is quite a technical challenge. I understand that there are one or two few exceptions that will be recorded because of time zone issues. At any point in time, somewhere in the world, it's the middle of the night, so you can understand that. We expect over 900 presentations across the conference week, and they will include oral and visual sessions and, of course, complementary parallel events, and I hope you'll be able to catch as much as possible of all of those presentations. This year we have 3 themed plenary sessions, and I hope many of you managed to attend the opening plenary, which was on innovations in PV technology this morning, and we'll be able to connect to the next 2 plenaries, which will be innovation in the PV industry and deployment on Wednesday morning, and PV in the energy system on Friday morning. And also just to note that, especially for this conference, you'll be able to catch up with presentations that you've missed. I understand there'll be recordings of the sessions available to you a few hours after delivery. It's particularly useful for me because I've never really been able to decide which of the parallel sessions I want to go to. There's always so many topics I like to hear. One of the main joys of the conference is also the ability to network with other delegates. And of course, although we have session breaks, we don't have the ability to be together during those breaks. But there is a range of options on the platform for you to allow you to continue to communicate with others. All the sessions, both the oral and the visual, have a facility for you to ask questions, either by typing them in on the oral sessions or by direct contact with the visual presenters. And I also want to point you towards the dedicated chat rooms. There's one for each of the topic areas, and our oral presenters will be encouraged to go to those chat rooms after their sessions so as to be able to continue the discussion, which really is kind of the virtual equivalent of continuing the discussion in the coffee break. Although, of course, this time you have to bring your own coffee. And you can also send messages directly to other participants to arrange virtual meetings. So remember to check your personal area and the messages to see what messages you've been sent. Over the last few years, alongside advances in the technology and reductions in costs, we've seen the PV market around the world growing strongly each year. But it's clear that 2020 is going to be a bit different because of the effect of lockdowns and restricted activities in many countries over the first half of the year and indeed ongoing in some places. Many countries have suggested that their recovery plans will include a focus on addressing climate change, although we've yet to see how this will be reflected in actions, of course. The PV community as a whole needs to make sure that the value of the contribution of photovoltaics to that recovery is clearly articulated, especially since we're liable to be in an investment environment that's rather uncertain. Fortunately, the conference program can help us to develop our arguments because there's a range of sessions on different topics. I just want to mention a few which have caught my eye, which I want to sort of point you towards. Presentations on electrical storage, electric vehicles, buildings and landscape, and agriculture and ecological applications. Sessions that are going to inform the way in which PV can be promoted. And also I'd like to flag up the panel discussion, which will be in the session immediately after this one, later this morning, which also addresses how PV can contribute to the recovery from the situation we're in at the moment. Of course, it's also been a rather difficult time for PV researchers to maintain their activities. And that makes it all the more pleasing that we've got so many contributions to this conference. And I'd like to thank in advance all the contributors for the efforts they've gone to in order to be able to present their work this week. Because one of the effects of the current pandemic relates directly to employment, we're liable to see issues with job retention and job creation. I also want to encourage the whole of the community to support one another across the sector and to strengthen efforts to create opportunities for young researchers and young engineers as we go forward. When we have a situation where travel is restricted, communication is restricted, it's sometimes the younger members of our community that actually suffer the most. So I hope that we can make sure that they are included fully in everything we do. It's also clear that young people in many countries are very committed to addressing climate change, and I hope that we can also provide many of them with options for careers in the renewable energy sector. There was a rather interesting recent survey done by a UK electricity company who work in clean energy, who found that in a survey of people from 18 to 30, or maybe 18 to 34, actually, I think, they found around 57% said they would rather work in a clean energy company, or a clean company which had clean credentials, than in a conventional sort of industry. And I think we want to try and encourage and tap into that resource in terms of the enthusiasm for our topic area. We have a keynote address today, which is actually going to consider that sort of area as well. It looks at how we can make the energy transition to systems which have a high renewable content, and specifically how we can ultimately get to 100% renewable energy. So at this point, I would like to introduce our speaker for this morning. It's a great pleasure to welcome Elias de Keyser from Next Kraftwerke. And I would like to ask him to give his presentation on moving to 100% renewable energy. Elias, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for this nice introduction. And thanks a lot to the organization also for welcoming me to give this keynote speech on virtual power plants. If all goes well, you're able to see my slides now as well. And maybe appropriate for the first virtual version of the EU PVSEC conference, I will also talk about virtual power plants today. We will go into detail what virtual power plants are exactly in a few minutes. But first of all, I think most of you in the audience today, you're working day in, day out in making solar cells, solar panels, solar systems more performant, have a higher lifetime, have higher efficiencies. And thanks to the great work that you have been doing over the past decades, we see that solar is now one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest source of renewable electricity production in many places around the world. And that's thanks to all your great work. The question more and more becomes, how can we make sure that all that renewable solar power is safely injected in the grid and reaches the consumer in a good way without endangering a safe operation of our electricity systems, which were in many cases designed with a totally different topology in mind. And that's exactly what we try to do, what we try to answer at Next Kraftwerke. We have developed a virtual power plant to integrate as many renewables as possible in our electricity grids. And to understand that, we have to go back to the basics, right? A safe electricity grid is a grid where the frequency remains stable. As most of you will know, our electricity grids are mostly alternating current based, and in Europe they have a frequency of about 50 Hertz. And it's very important to keep that frequency stable around this 50 Hertz, otherwise we risk blackouts or brownouts with potentially catastrophic results. The way how we can keep that 50 Hertz stable is by making sure that on a second-by-second basis, the injection of power into our electricity grids equals the offtake, the consumption in the electricity grid. That might sound easy in one sentence or on paper, but in reality, that's actually quite a challenging task. And how we do that in an energy system like in Europe is by setting up a series of electricity wholesale markets and balancing markets, which will ensure that at any given point in time, price signals indicate how much demand there is and how much supply there is. And this will ensure that both will always meet. In case there is not enough power, or there is too much power, actually the transmission system operators or the national system operators, they will intervene and they have some power plants at their availability to ramp up or ramp down power to make sure that the balance in the system is restored. And that's how it's used to run since a few decades, since the liberalization of the electricity market at the end of the 90s and the beginning of this century. And that actually is a very advanced system and that worked really well. But this was not really taking into account yet the rise of renewables and the energy transition. And the energy transition, with an increase of variable energy production and variable consumption as well, with the rise of electric vehicles and electrification of the heating sector and industry, this rise of variable sources and demand, that's challenging the status quo, that's challenging the way how we operate our grids. On the one hand, we cannot operate a renewable power plant portfolio in the same way as we were operating gas plants and coal plants. It's a totally different story, and we need to find new ways to operate solar assets, wind assets, and other renewables in an efficient and effective way. And secondly, the conventional way how grid operators used to balance our systems and make sure the lights stayed on was by counting on flexible gas-fired power plants primarily. The thing is, gas-fired power plants, they are not renewable. They're fossil fuel based, and more and more of them are also struggling to be profitable, and many are closing down. So the question really is, do we want to rely on these fossil fuel based power plants to maintain the balance and maintain the safety in our grids? I think for me, it's pretty clear that the answer is no. But then, of course, the question is, what else is there? And how can we make sure that going forward, where we slowly decarbonize our grids and go to 100%, or at least hopefully as close to 100% renewables, how can we make sure that we still keep our grids running safely? Well, thankfully, renewables actually don't need to be a threat. They can be part of the solution. And that is mainly thanks to major developments in digitalization and in data technology. Today, it's possible to gather data, transmit and distribute data, process it and store it in enormous quantities, and all of this in a relatively reliable and secure way. And it's also by far not as expensive as it used to be maybe 10 or 20 years ago. So it has become very easy to gather data, to send over data over large distances. And that's extremely useful for distributed renewable energy resources like solar power. It allows us to monitor what is happening at individual solar parks. And even within the solar park, it allows us to monitor what's going on at each string level or even the panel level. And that allows us to optimize forecasting of the solar production to make sure we can participate as optimal as possible in the wholesale electricity markets, so that the financial performance of renewable assets is gonna increase. But secondly, we cannot only monitor and see what's happening, we can actually remotely control renewable power plants. And that becomes important when we want to participate more actively with our power plants in, for example, the balancing markets, where we actually want to help the grid operators restore the balance in the grid in case there is too much power production, for example, at certain point in time. So thanks to data transmission that has become so much cheaper and so much more reliable and secure, we can start doing a lot of new things. We can take it even one step further, and we can allow digitalization allows aggregation. Aggregation is the action of clustering a lot of smaller decentralized assets all in one pool. And these can be all of the same technology or even different technologies. And on my slide here, I have shown some technologies that we pull together at Next Kraftwerke, being solar power, being wind power, but also energy storage, and even demand response through industrial processes like electrolysis, or in the agricultural sector with greenhouses, and even slowly, more and more, also even households with electric vehicles or electric boilers, where we can pool them together and participate with these assets as if we were one big power plant. And that's also why we coined it the virtual power plant. With a lot of small assets, we are actually doing the same things that the conventional power plants, which were fossil fuel based and which were placed in one spot, we're actually now doing the same thing with assets which are spread all around Western Europe, right? So what does that mean for solar power? Solar power can perfectly be part of such a virtual power plant. And it has two main advantages. The first one, which I already touched upon, is that we can better monitor what is happening at different solar plants, right? We can monitor in detail and at second by second basis what is the power production. And that's very useful right now, but also going forward. First of all, right now it allows us to update our energy production forecasts based on which we make the trades in the electricity wholesale markets. So if our forecasts were a bit off, monitoring the power production in real time actually allows us to correct for that and sell or buy any excess or short power that we encounter. So it increases the performance right now, but it also increases the performance going forward, because all the data we gather, we can feed into our machine learning algorithms, which improve the forecasting for the future. Secondly, I also already touched upon it, being part of a virtual power plant means that you can be controlled remotely, and we can see if the grid operator has somewhere a congestion issue, if there is an excess of power in the grid, or if prices in the electricity markets maybe go negative, we're able to partially or fully curtail a solar plant. Yeah, and this way we actually make an important paradigm shift from 10 years ago or 20 years ago, where solar plants were built and then they would start injecting power in the grid. Often grid operators and energy companies were relatively blind to how much was being produced. It was just put on the grid and it was taken as is. And we're moving towards a system where we're way more accurately are going to try to forecast what is going to be produced, and even potentially going to curtail that, manipulate that to make sure we integrate these well in the overall energy system. And that is quite interesting because we can start combining it with other technologies, for example, also with energy storage or with flexible biogas units. And at that point, we actually get a renewable power plant which is fully dispatchable, which we can fully operate in a way that we desire, and we're less dependent on when the sun is actually shining. Now, to illustrate that, I brought a couple of graphs. The first one here shows the power of having that real-time production data. In the blue line, you see the forecast 1 day ahead, 1 day before actual production and delivery for our solar portfolio. Why do we need to have a day ahead forecast? Well, it's because one of the most important wholesale electricity markets is taking place 1 day before delivery. It's called literally the day ahead market, the day ahead electricity market. So we need to accurately forecast our power production and trade and sell our power as accurately as possible in the day ahead market. But thanks to the fact that we're now monitoring how much our power plants are actually producing in the day itself, which you see in green, in the green line here on my graph, we see that we made an under forecast and they were actually producing more. And so instead of just let that happen, we're gonna make additional trades in what is now called the intraday markets. These are markets that are organized within the day itself to allow mostly renewable operators to still buy and sell any short or excess power that they notice throughout the day. And the more we improve these intraday forecast updates, the more we are sure we're actually trading away differences in our forecast so that the grid operator is not caught off guard by big swings in the grid and big mismatches between supply and demand. So this way we are actively contributing to a more stable grid. And we're also making the financial performance of our solar plant better, which can of course only be a good thing for the asset owners and the investors in the solar plants. I brought a second graph here as well. So on the gray bars, you see the hourly prices in the electricity market in one day. It was actually a Sunday in April this year in Belgium. And you see the power prices fluctuate, and actually at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the price became about zero, and the 3 hours afterwards, the prices even became negative. And that was a combination of a very sunny day and low demand. And on any Sunday, demand is already low. And especially in April, with the lockdown measures in place, demand was specifically low, or especially low. And we see that the prices became negative. In yellow, you see the production of a specific solar park in our portfolio. And we could have kept it running as it would usually do throughout the afternoon. But in that case, we would actually have to pay to put that energy onto the grid. During the hours with negative prices, we actually have to pay to inject power into the grid. So we want to avoid that, and therefore we can now remotely curtail the power plants which find themselves in a region or in a country where prices go negative, right? So again, it contributes to a better financial performance of the power plant, but again, it also contributes to the stability of the grid, because what these negative prices actually say is that there is a large excess of renewable power production and a shortage of demand at that point in time. And if everybody keeps producing at that point, we will get into a dangerous situation in the grid. Now, the question is, of course, is that idea of a virtual power plant, remotely controlling decentralized asset, is that a dream? Is that a concept? Is that a white paper? Luckily, it's not. We at Next Kraftwerke have been doing that since 2009. So about 10 years ago, our founders, Jochen and Hendrik, who were doing a PhD in renewable energy, they saw that there was a big opportunity to start working on solutions to integrate renewable energy into the grid in a smarter way than grid operators and energy companies were doing so far. And so we have built that IT infrastructure to monitor and control renewable assets all over Europe. And today, more than 9,000 decentralized assets have been connected. That's a capacity a bit more than 8.5 gigawatts, so more than 8 big nuclear power plants. And a bit more than 3 gigawatts of that is solar. And the rest are other resources, wind, biogas, energy storage, and more also industrial processes, which we can flexibly steer in what most people know as demand response. And recently, we even have added also some electric vehicles. So this is an exciting field where we are trying to pull together different resources, because we see that the more different technologies you bring together, the more reliable you can manage a portfolio with renewables. Now, there still might be some skeptics in the room, and to convince you that it does make a difference, these kind of solutions, I brought a graph about the German situation where on the blue line and the green trend line, you see the increase of renewable injection of solar and wind into the Dutch electricity system. This has about doubled in the last 7 years, while at the same time, the need of balancing power, the need to intervene for the grid operators in Germany through the balancing markets has actually decreased. And that's shown in the small gray bars here at the very bottom. And you see that by the end of this 7-year period, these bars have decreased in size. So even though we have more renewable energy joining the grid, actually the need for balancing has decreased. And this is because of several factors, one of them being solutions like virtual power plants winning in popularity, right? On the green bars, you see the volume that is traded in the intraday markets that I mentioned before. So you see that actually more and more parties connect their systems to trading floors of virtual power plants, where we will try to forecast really well what is going to be produced and make sure we trade away any differences still before actually the actual production is going to happen. And this has contributed to a safer and more stable grid. So this just goes to show that more renewables, it doesn't need to mean an issue for our grids, but we need to do things differently from what we're used to. And for that, virtual power plants can be part of the solution. I'm not going to claim they are the only one, but I do believe they're an important tool in that toolkit going forward to a future with 100% renewables. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for giving me the chance to share these ideas, this concept and the solution we have developed with you today. I wish you all a very nice conference as well. It is virtual. That is a bit challenging, as has been said a couple of times, but I think it also creates new opportunities. And so I hope you have very interesting discussions, a lot of good exchanges. And with that, I think Nicola still has a few questions reserved for me to roast me on the ideas I shared here. But with that, I really want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elias. It was a very interesting, very clear presentation. Yeah, I get the honor of asking questions in this session, and I hope I'll represent what the audience would like to ask, but I get the privilege of asking what I'm interested in. It's obviously a really interesting concept as the virtual power plant, but for an individual system owner, so a solar owner or a wind owner, where you're remotely controlling, how do you decide which plant gets curtailed in order to balance the system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. It depends a bit, first of all, on the wishes and the desires of the power plant owner themselves, of course. It depends a lot whether the power plant is still receiving subsidies. For a power plant that still gets subsidies, then the prices need to go first very negative before it's worth curtailing the power and losing the subsidy. So based on that, we make a priority list of which assets at which price levels can be curtailed and which can only be curtailed later. And then secondly, it depends very much on which grid operator, sometimes national grid operators, sometimes distribution level, so very local grid operators, where the problem arises. If it's a local problem, obviously, we will tackle that problem with solar assets in that specific region.
And kind of linked to that, would it make sense for individual plants to have storage on site so that they could store the energy when they're curtailed to be used later? And does that already happen?
Mm-hmm. There is definitely a big rise in renewables plus storage, or solar plus storage, as it is known today. That is still mostly in the US, states like California, and also in Australia, because we see the grid is less capable there of dealing with the large growth of renewables so far. So curtailment happens far more often. There is also certain incentive schemes which stimulate renewables plus storage. So in most European countries, it is not yet entirely financially profitable to integrate a big storage system with your solar system. But this is definitely going to come going forward in the next years when renewables keep penetrating the grid and keep driving down prices at, for example, these very sunny afternoons.
Okay, last question. Obviously, you've demonstrated this practically with your portfolio of around 8.5 gigawatts of plants. How fast do you think that the energy system in Europe could transition to basically pretty much 100% renewables across the board?
Mm-hmm. That's, of course, a very tricky question. It will depend on a lot of factors. And as you mentioned before, it will depend a lot on how we respond to the current crisis and the economic crisis that is probably still going to unfold itself. If we choose to make this really the moment to go for a green recovery and put a lot of our efforts towards investing in renewables and creating new jobs in renewables, I believe we can go a very long way towards that 100% by 2035, 2040. But it really will come down to the next 1.5 or 2 years, which decisions policymakers, both on the national and the European level, take on how we're going to respond to the COVID recovery.
Thank you very much, Elias. That's a perfect ending for this part of the conference. It brings us to the end of this part of the opening session. I'd like to remind everybody that the next part will be a panel discussion, and it will be addressing the role of PV in the Green Deal, the EU recovery plan, and aspects of industry and employment that I think everybody will find very interesting. I'm certainly looking forward to it. So that will start in just under 10 minutes time back on this channel, and I encourage you to listen in to the panel discussion, and I wish everyone an enjoyable and a successful conference. Thank you.